So we're here today to talk about reusable CI/CD pipelines, specifically with Jenkins, but I guess in general, a lot of these topics apply to pretty much anything in terms of if you're using other CI tools or just in general around how teams collaborate. And I thought rather than sort of doing a more general talk, I'd focus on something specific around serverless. And so some of these things are also focused around how teams, and from the experience that I've had recently working with a bunch of teams on the sort of serverless journey, right? So they've moved from some traditional application stacks and then looking at how they approach serverless development differently, or how they migrate existing applications to serverless as well. And some of those have direct kind of a direct application to the sort of CI/CD process, right? And how you need a flexible process, and you need to be able to sort of fit in with that, and how quickly it can grow. So once a team kind of adopts the model, and adopts it properly in terms of breaking down things, and they can really take advantage of that. So firstly, a bit about me. So my background is as a old school Java software developer, and so I come from an application background, but I guess in the last probably last 5 or 6, maybe 7 years, I've been working on the sort of infrastructure side of things. So working with teams around infrastructure automation and helping teams, especially in the operations space, develop software principles, right, as software developers. So applying continuous integration and continuous delivery to infrastructure automation, to configuration management, more recently in cloud, sort of around automation of infrastructure builds and those kinds of things, and also putting the same kind of CI/CD practices together, and then bringing teams together, the operations team and the dev team together around developing those types of skills together, right? And unifying both infrastructure and application technology. Have a lot of experience with AWS, have been working sort of primarily focusing on AWS technologies for about 10 years, so doing development on top of AWS, and now helping customers migrate, build, deploy to cloud infrastructure, but really focusing on AWS. So the company I work for is a company called Reusable Services. We are headquartered out of Melbourne, Australia, as you can tell probably from my accent. You know, I'm not German. And we might have guessed English, but maybe not. So I'm Australian, but I'm based in Berlin. We've just recently expanded to this region. We also have an office in the US as well. And yeah, so part of the role that I'm here to do is to sort of spread the word about what we do and how we do it, but sort of focusing on really the sort of development team experience. So some of the challenges that I've seen, I guess, really probably within the last 18 months, 2 years, sort of serverless has become a thing, and development teams, a lot of teams, they understand the concepts behind it, but they haven't quite worked out how to embrace it, right? So they're facing a number of challenges on how do they do that, right? So, and the other challenge is they pick something, and then, very quickly they find that it might work at small scale, individual teams doing individual pieces of work, but when they try and roll that out across the rest of the team, they struggle. So, and I guess when also teams really, one of the fundamental things they struggle with is, well, what do I choose? Frameworks, platforms, technologies, right? And so they often, there's a plethora of frameworks out there. There's the serverless framework itself, which is very confusingly named, because people talk of serverless, do they mean the serverless framework, or they mean the concept, or do they mean AWS Lambda? As often it's like these terms get mixed up, and they often provide confusion to teams when they are trying to communicate to other teams what they're doing and how they're doing it. And there's plenty of other frameworks like the AWS SAM, the Serverless Application Model, Zappa. There's a million of them, and so teams might choose one, another team might choose another. I've got customers that half of them are using the serverless framework, half of them using SAM, some of them using hand rolled. That's the most other common thing that you find is people go and build their own sort of ways of packaging serverless applications themselves. And so you have to kind of deal with that when you're trying to look at, from a CI perspective, how do I do this in a consistent way across all of these teams? So that's, I guess, another big challenge is that, right? So how do I do that? How do I build that consistency across different teams? Like, how do I, from a CI process perspective, ensure that all the teams are at least following what the organizational requirements are? We work with a lot of customers that have regulatory compliance requirements, and so they really struggle, right, with making sure that as they start to adopt these things from a deployment process, making sure that the teams are adhering to those standards, right? And so if they're all off doing their own things and deploying new frameworks, how do they ensure that that process is being followed? I guess another one is the development experience can be quite different. So building a traditional application, probably most developers in this room are probably used to doing development locally on their laptop, right? And in some cases with serverless technologies, you can do that, right? The serverless framework has an offline plugin. SAM has this concept of SAM local, where you can run a bunch of the services in an offline mode on your laptop. But again, that's not always, that can lead to it's working on my laptop, but it's not working when I deploy it to AWS. And that's because a lot of the services that run locally aren't the same. They're not the exact service that you're dealing with. You're dealing with DynamoDB local, which is just an API compatible thing, or some of the other frameworks that mock out other services, right? So they don't exactly behave the same. And so then there's this thing, well, why don't I just develop in the cloud, right? Why don't I just have all my developers either have their own accounts or manage it that way? And it's totally manageable, right, to do that. And then the experience is, okay, so how do I make sure that that's managed in a way and that integrates well with our CI process, and making sure that that when they spin up resources, when they're naming resources, that things all work fine from that perspective. So there's a different mindset when it comes to doing that, and having a really good CI process at the core for each individual team means that you can make sure you hit those issues, right? So that your developers might be pushing from their laptops into their local cloud environment, where they might be sandboxed in the resources that they can consume, but when they go to deploy that or merge that code, that's going through a process that if they've gone and said, oh well, this name can only be created once, and if I try and create like a branch with the same resource with the same name, it's going to fail. And so you know that, right? And you capture those things. Also, a lot of the different serverless frameworks themselves have different levels of integration with sort of traditional CI tools, right? So, the Jenkins has a serverless framework plugin, which is kind of okay and kind of works, and the same with SAM local and SAM itself. There's integration, but at the end of the day, looking at having a standardized process from a development workflow and making that integrate with, and keeping a consistent, for example, if I build it locally a particular way, then the same process I use the CI tools should do the same. I should be running the same commands, or I should be running the same set of tools, or I should be using the same versions. I'll talk about, when I go through a demo, I'll kind of highlight that, and then I'll really need to get the screen working, but it will fall back to the monitor if need be. And everyone can crowd around a bit more. So I think that's really the different levels of integration is a factor, right? So in looking at doing that, but also looking at the end-to-end process as well. One of the other things that you want to be mindful of is you can go, okay, so I could easily create a consistent CI process for the teams. Is everyone does it the one way. Every team has to use Node.js as the development language, and that they have to have a very standardized build process and use the same set of plugins and do all those kinds of things, right? So that everyone is consistent. And that works. That's a valid option, right? Is you constrain the technology choices, and that can lead to productivity, but it also can stifle teams, right? Teams, especially in organizations where you're trying to, if you happen to be the team that's trying to champion the adoption of say a serverless approach within your organization, you don't necessarily want to be going in and saying, now this team over here happens to be doing Python, and no, you can't do Python, you have to do Node, because this is how it's for us to be consistent across this process. This is what we need to do, right? So that's, I guess, one of the things that is often a challenge is allowing that freedom, and that with freedom comes those differences, right? So how do I make sure that those differences are that choice is there, so teams can choose to do the things that they want to do. They can use different frameworks, so one might use serverless framework, one might use SAM, and that's okay, right? That's okay for them to do that. And so I think that's sort of something that's a really important factor in that, is that maintaining that freedom of choice within the teams, and then using different techniques to help with the sort of standardization and the reusability of that. And hopefully I can actually show you that when we get to the demo. So let's talk about some tips for creating reusable pipelines, right? So let's actually dive down a little deeper into some things that from my experience, really help teams kind of adopt a particular approach, but also ensuring that the teams can work with it, and that they can achieve at the end goal, they can achieve some consistency and some reusability. Abstract, one of the commands that are used to actually build and deploy the software, right? So abstract them away into a sort of standard thing. And I don't know if maybe I'm showing my age, but I'm a big fan of make-files, right? Doesn't matter what type of programming language you're doing, I'm a huge fan of make-files, because at the end of the day, if I run make and then, install or deploy, it doesn't matter what that does, right? It's up to the person that implemented that make file. So if the contract is make deploy or make test, and then that behind the scenes runs, Mocha, or it runs, a JavaScript testing framework, or it runs PyTest, or it runs, a Maven build and does a Maven test, or whatever. It doesn't really matter at that point, right? So, don't be afraid to do that, right? And then that means that it makes it relatively easy for teams to kind of pick up a project and they know how to build it, right? So if you're in your organization, you've got a sort of standardized makefile template, then that can really make the whole build process, even locally, work really well and eliminate some differences. Or at least have some form of standardized script, right? The classic kind of build.sh or build.bat, right? You see that in a lot of projects. So at least having some form of standardized script, but make to me is just, it makes a lot of sense. So, no pun intended. The other thing is, so package the tools. So if you're using the serverless framework, package the serverless framework itself, any of its dependencies, any of your project's dependencies from a tooling perspective and from an automation perspective in a Docker container, right? And even put the Docker file in the project itself. Even if it's a serverless project and it's going to be deployed to Lambda, but have like a Docker file.build, right? And put it in the project, or at least have it in a central repository that the team can access. And the idea behind this is you package all those dependencies, and that Docker file describes those dependencies and describes the versions of the tools they're using, and the CI platform can leverage that to do the build, right? So in your pipeline, you can say, I'm going to make my build agent this particular Docker image, right? Or this particular Docker file that's in the checked out source, right? And it'll actually do a build of that image first. It also means that developers themselves can actually leverage that. So they can leverage the same Docker file to do that locally, right? So that they don't want to have those tools installed, right? They can just build that image and then run that Docker container and run the build commands to do that, or run the commands to run it locally if they're doing local development, right? So that makes it you avoid the developer going and saying, well, I'm just going to npm install serverless. I got some random version that we may or may not work, right? So that you can actually promote the version. And if the Docker file's in the repo with the code, you can kind of version that as you go, right? So that I can say, well, a developer can make a branch and test the latest version of serverless against the CI pipeline as well, right? So then they create that branch, that'll trigger that process for that branch, and they can test that. And so they can test end to end that change for that upgrade, right? And then they can merge that, and then everyone else is going to get it, right? And they're going to know that, okay, well, this version is now good, especially if you've got test coverage for that. So that makes that whole process of upgrading versions of tools and things really easy, right? And also visible. So if something does break downstream, you can go, oh, okay, well, someone changed the serverless version. Obviously, it's not working with this particular feature or this particular, more often than not, it's probably a plugin that broke when it comes to the serverless framework, because it's quite brittle with those things, third-party contributed plugins. And so that's something that's easy to then manage, right? You can see, okay, cool, the dependency got updated as part of the, I can see the package.json, I can see an upgrade, I can see it broke, right? So it's pretty clear. And it makes local development easier as well. So you can have, as part of the make file, like to actually run the container, right? So so you can get that kind of, so the developer just can go make, and then they can get an interactive shell, or you can wrap some scripts around it to make that process easier. The other thing that's really useful, this is kind of more specifically Jenkins related, is using Jenkins pipelines. You can basically roll up sort of repeated steps as a custom step, right? So using Jenkins shared libraries, you can go and say, well, hey, we have these 10 things that we do to basically package and deploy the application. We can logically roll it up into deploy my app as a step. I want to deploy my app, and it's got a bunch of parameters, and we'll go through the demo, and I'll try and switch that, otherwise we'll get the screen working. And so that basically means that you can remove the complexity, right? So that goes a lot of way to creating the reusability, right? That's the first step to creating that reusability. Is okay, so these logical steps, we can roll them up into one thing, right? So that the pipeline itself should read. It shouldn't be a bunch of shell scripts blocks with calling random shell commands. It should be logical things that you're doing, right? And you can roll those steps up, and then you can make them configurable. You can write those steps using the pipeline DSL, so which is in Groovy, and you can pretty much do whatever you want at that point in time, right? And I'll go and show some examples of some of the ones we've done, and we've made them public, and in a public GitHub repo. That we use extensively throughout our pipelines, right? So for doing different things, and we've kind of logically rolled them up and provide them as open source. And the last one really is keep the pipeline descriptor itself as small as possible. Keep random fragments of code out. Resist the urge to drop out to a script. In the case of Jenkins, avoid the script block if you can, and only use it where you need to, because you end up with pipelines that aren't very readable, right? You want to make it pretty obvious when you look at it to say, hey, okay, I've got these 5 steps, and it's doing the packaging, it's doing the testing, it's doing a deployment to a dev environment based on some condition, it's doing a deployment to staging given the branch it's master, and then if it's production, okay, maybe I'll have a user input promoted step, right? And so it's clearly visible when you look at that file what it's doing. It's not like, 10 pages long of doing that. And even better if you can kind of abstract the pipeline out as well. That's all right. So creating a shared library that represents a standardized pipeline within your organization, right? And I've got an example of that as well. So yeah, that's really, I guess, an important one is to think about, and then think about it from a team perspective, right? So an individual team, they'll have their specific requirements about what they want to do, but from an organizational standpoint, think about the steps that you want to perform, right? And if you think about it from this way, if you've got a team that has adopted serverless and it's gone great and they've got their own pipeline and they're deploying to production, and then they go and another team does that and they go, oh cool, we'll start with your pipeline and we'll copy that and then we'll use that as a starting point. And they'll go and do that, and then the next team will do that, and the next team will do that. And so you've got 50 pipelines, right? That they kind of share, some of them, teams have gone in and tweaked it because this is a Python team, and so they've done some changes for Python. Then it basically got the same, deploy to dev, maybe they've got feature branching capabilities, right? So that one team says, well, we want anything with feature / to go and create an environment, right, as well, to deploy an API to a particular environment for every feature branch. And other teams like, well, we're just doing trunk-based development, so we're just going to deploy to dev, and then if it gets merged, we're going to deploy to staging and production based on promotion, right? So very quickly you end up with differences, right? And then someone comes along and says, oh, okay, now we need to do, as part of some compliance requirement that's new, like maybe GDPR or something like that, we have to do some form of scanning, right? Across, everyone has to do this step. They have to run some form of security analysis, vulnerability scan, whatever, right? So that every one of those teams has to go back and modify their pipeline to do that, right? And so that becomes problematic. And so having some way to say, well, okay, we're going to share this pipeline. We're going to share a core principle, and then have different ways of configuring that pipeline. And I'll show an example of that as well. So let me endeavor to get this working. And I'll crank up so I'm assuming down the back you probably really can't see this, so I'll try and make it really big. Right. Alright. Annoyingly, it's probably going to work now. Alright, so as I was talking about before, here's a really simple, I've got a really simple demo. It's a TypeScript demo because I refuse to write pure Node because I'm not crazy. So here's a really simple makefile, right? It's got an install, it's got a test, it's got an SSM, which is something I won't cover in this thing, but it's basically and a deploy package and a deploy which calls both of those. Right, so there's a very simple serverless project, right? And so from a pipeline perspective, let me try and get rid of that. And I will need that, so I'll leave it there. So it's a really simple pipeline. Can everyone kind of see that, or do I need to make it bigger? Cool. Right, so it's a really simple Jenkins pipeline. It's one thing that I don't know, who here has experience with pipelines, Jenkins pipelines? Oh, good, awesome. So do you know the library? So who knows this particular step? Who uses it? Right, cool, okay, good. So basically what this is doing is this instructing the pipeline to go and load a shared library, right? The shared library is defined by name, and it's defined in the configuration of Jenkins. And I can, if you're interested to know how to set this up, come and talk to me afterwards, and I'll show you. Another thing that I mentioned before about the Docker slave, right? So in this case, I don't have the Docker file in the repo, but I actually have a sort of an image that's produced as part of a standardized build process that we use. So I'm telling the pipeline to use that specific agent. I can also then run that agent locally, right? So I can, let me just drop out of here because I'm actually inside Docker container. So I can run a Docker command here, which basically you could script up or put in the make file or whatever to do this, but basically what it's doing is it's running the same container that the pipeline is using. It's mounting the directory locally, and it's also mounting my AWS creds, right? So that I can run deploy commands from my laptop, right? So if I want to deploy a particular environment, I can do that. So I can run that, and then basically from this point on, I'm in the same environment that my CI pipeline would be using, right? So the same agent, it would basically start it basically the same way. And then I can run the same commands. So I can run my make install, which does horrible npm things. Then I can run my make test to run my unit tests locally. And while that's going, so it's basically a very simple pipeline that has horrible things in that I talked about not doing, but script blocks are useful for doing things like this is creating creating this, in the case serverless has this concept of stages, and so for every PR and for every feature branch, it's going to create a stack. So it's going to create and deploy that, and it's going to name it based on the name of the, in the case of a PR, the source branch, or it's going to create it based on the feature branch. So whatever the source branch to the PR, it's going to create an environment for that. And there's a bit of logic to do that. That could be rolled up as a step.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I'm trying to understand about the serverless part.
Sure.
And okay, there is a Docker agent, and where exactly does it run?
So the serverless, basically the agent is just used to run the serverless deploy commands, right? Which I'll get to. Like basically it's running in the deploy package stage, it's running the serverless deploy, right?
Okay, but the Docker container itself, it runs on some.
Yep, I'll show you the Jenkins that backs this up in a second. So those tests ran and it recorded the output of the tests, and it's good to go. So let me actually go and so the rest of the pipeline, so it runs unit tests, it runs the deploy itself, and so I was talking before about shared library steps, right? So this particular one does not exist in the standard Jenkins pipeline DSL, right? So this is one that's provided through that Cinnabox shared library, right? It's called with IAM role. And what this does is it basically, if I didn't have this, I'd probably have maybe 30 lines of random shells with greps to basically run an AWS STS command to switch roles to give me credentials, rather than having Jenkins with actual AWS credentials. Jenkins is running in AWS, it has an IAM role. The only thing it can do is assume another role to do something, right? And so we've got a process where we've restricted what Jenkins can actually do.
So a short question, is it possible that you bring this functionality from this custom function to, to the make file?
Yep, you could, yes.
But why you choose to use the Jenkins?
In the pipeline, because locally, in most cases when you're doing it locally, you know, it's not that. You put it in the make, if you put it in the make file, you end up with a large block of code, right? It's very easy to write the assume roles using the Java AWS SDK, right? So the with IAM roles is actually implemented as a step. And I can show you the code for that. That's actually probably a useful example, right? So I'll actually show you that. So this is the GitHub repo that these steps belong to. And that particular one with IAM roles. So basically all of these steps are documented here. That with IAM role is basically this particular code, right? So it's Groovy code, and it basically calls the AWS API to assume a particular role that's passed in, and then sets the environment with those credentials, right? So it gets those temporary credentials. And so whatever block of code that you wrap that in is then running in the context of those credentials. And at the end of it, it unpacks it as well. So it reverts whatever credentials happen to be there, if there were credentials in the workspace. So there's an example of that's quite a bit of code to do that, right? And if you're doing it in shell, it's even uglier because you're having to grab the text outputs to grab the keys and then export them, and it's a lot of sed awk grep, right, to do that, right? So if you want to do that in a pure pipeline kind of context, whereas this way you can simply include this shared library and then use that step as it is. That's why it's kind of done that way and not in the make file, because if it was in the make file, then you'd end up writing a bunch of shell, right, in the make file, or you'd have another script to do it. Whereas developers, when they're doing it, they'll have credentials, right? They'll have, however they're getting vended credentials for their AWS account, they'll be able to do that, which is why I volume mount that in so they can just run the serverless commands, or they can run the make file, and it'll be pre-authenticated to that, right? Whereas the pipeline is running actually in one account and deploying to another, right? In most cases, right? The pipeline's not running in the same account that that you're actually deploying to. So let me actually go and bring up the Jenkins instance, and I just need to quickly do something because otherwise we won't be able to access it. Let's just jump on the VPN and everyone can see me type my password. But it doesn't matter. Just need to put my info. Alright. Should have did this earlier. Right. So here's a Jenkins instance that I've set up earlier. And I've already configured it with the shared library running, and then it's already detected and set up a GitHub org project. The repos that are in here are in my public GitHub, so that you can look at them afterwards. And so basically, I've got a pipeline, and I pushed earlier, and it ran a commit. It's got a GitHub hook, and it basically built and deployed the API to dev or a feature branch or whatever, right? So, and at the moment there's nothing deployed. These other CloudFormation stacks are actually Jenkins itself. So let me actually quickly make a change, and we'll push that. Let me drop out of here. Let me get back to here. Right, I think there's already a change that needs to be committed just to the make file. Just make sure I haven't broken anything. I just changed the region, good. So let me just commit this. Push. I have aliases for this, so ignore what those commands are. It's basically git push origin develop. Okay, so that's pushed, and if I go to the pipeline now, all going well, it should trigger. Yep, so it triggered. So it's going to basically run those standardized, those steps, right? It's going to run a make test, it's going to run a make, and it's going to run the deploy.
Small question.
Sure.
And about these tests, are they running on the serverless in AWS?
So it depends. So they're just in this instance they're just TypeScript Jasmine tests with Mocha as the sort of wrapper layer, right? So there's nothing much. They're running in memory inside. They're actually running inside the container that this slave that's attached to this instance, right? So if you look outside of this, you can see there's a couple of executors that are attached, and it's running in one of them.
So
which is inside a container, which is running Docker inside a container. So it's Docker and Docker basically.
yeah, but are they persistent agents?
These two are persistent, but they don't need to be. You could run whatever agent. You could run the Docker slave plugin, and they could be dynamic slaves as well. It doesn't matter, right? So it's up to how you've configured Jenkins. In this case, I've got two persistent agents because I don't want to wait for them to provision. But for a lot of our customers, we'll use the EC2 plugin and we'll spin up EC2 with Docker on top of that and then use the slave plugin, however that works, right?
Okay, yeah, I'm just trying to understand what is the advantage of using serverless against these on-demand EC2 instances.
Well, the serverless part is the application itself, right? So what it's doing now is it's actually building and deploying the application, right?
Oh, I see. So there is no relation. So between unit tests, for example, they're still running on a sample.
Yeah, and you could run integration tests that run against the deployed, right? So one of the things we won't have time, but there's another demo that sort of introduces an integration test step into the pipeline, right?
I see. So okay, so the application in this case is itself serverless.
Correct.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. So as you can see, it's creating a stack, right? So it's creating a stack for that particular stage, right? In this case, dev. Yep. And so yeah. So basically, yeah. So if you actually now look at the output of the pipeline, you can actually run the commands, right? And it's outputted the endpoint of the API, right? So this particular API sends a message to SQS and returns the result back to itself, right? So it basically runs and echoes back a sort of payload. Yeah, so and in terms of the actual serverless project itself, there's really nothing, like I haven't done anything specific to the serverless project to sort of make it support this. And this comes back down to whatever teams are doing, they can do whatever they want. They can use whatever serverless plugins they want. They can use the serverless framework to do whatever they want. In this particular instance, I'm also creating CloudFormation resources with that, and recording that and sort of doing that. So there's nothing specific in the serverless framework, which comes back to that letting teams choose what they want to do, right? So the other example is, I've got another team comes along, they like that idea, and they go, okay, cool, well, but we're a Python, like we want to use Python, so we want to use the serverless framework, but with Python, right? So here's another example that uses Python, right? And basically, they can take the same Jenkins file. This is the whole, I can just copy and paste it. And God's willing, if I add this, let's get rid of that. So, now let's go back to Jenkins, and if everything is good, we might get the new, there we go. So it's automatically picked up that new repo, and it's kicked off a build. And I did something that I said was bad, right? I just copied and pasted the pipeline, but it was more just to show you that if I've got a standardized makefile for the Python project, that the same pipeline is mostly going to work. It failed this time because the make tests. But the concept of this is then you go, okay, well, that's great, but I don't want to copy and paste the pipeline, right? So an alternative to that is to create a shared library, right? And I've already done this. So let me just go file, call it. So I've got a Git repo that's basically empty. I'm going to create a Groovy script. Right, so this is basically a wrapper around my existing pipeline, right? So this is basically, you saw this is my pipeline inside this Groovy, this sort of Groovy wrapper. I've got a couple of other different things that I'm passing in some configuration to it, so that the ability to basically define my pipeline. So instead of my pipeline being that large block, I can basically use this inside my Jenkins file instead. So instead of all of this, I can replace it with this. And then I just need to specify the accounts that I want to deploy to. Which account ID is my dev account, which account ID is my prod account, right? And then just configure Jenkins to load the shared library from a pipeline. So let me just quickly show you what that looks like, because that's probably worthwhile. And then we can probably just wrap up from there. So you go basically to do shared libraries in Jenkins. There's a couple of ways you can do it. You can do it at a global level, or you can do it within the GitHub org folder itself. I'll do it at the global level, because it's probably the most common one. So you go into Jenkins and go configure, and then you go and find the block where it's sectioned. So if you look here, if you can't read that, let me just crank that up a bit. Not too much, because then it makes it too hard to read. Where are you hiding? It's gone now. It's too big now. There. Right, so that was the Cinebox, that was where that name comes from, right? So it's just simply that there. So that's the name I mentioned in the thing. And there's a default version, there's a GitHub repo, and there's no creds, right? So again, we can go GitHub. Sorry, I need to add a new one. Add. We'll call it pipelines. And that matches that name, we'll make the default master. And then we'll grab the actual repo itself, which I think is this one. Use HTTPS. And go to here, and then specify London, specify Git. Oops, why is that? Copy. And paste. There we go. Right, so I've specified that it's called pipelines, that default version, right? So this is one of the nice things about shared pipelines as well, is that I can lock my pipeline to a specific revision of the repo, right? So I might say that I only want to use like a tagged one. So you can specify a specific version, and that'll override the default version, right? So that means that what's nice is if for some reason that your pipeline breaks because someone made a change, well, you can just lock it to a specific version, or you can lock it by default and say that you always have to pick a new version. One of the reasons why we don't do that is it then is onerous on the whoever's using that pipeline to do that. And one of the nice things about shared libraries is you can get new functionality within steps, right? So an example, recently we have a CloudFormation step, which basically manages CloudFormation stacks, create updates, deletes, those kinds of things in the Jenkins step. And we added support for SSM parameters, so loading and saving parameters from SSM. And without anybody doing anything, all of our pipelines inherited that behavior, right? So they could simply opt in or turn it on, or we decided to turn it on by default. So that made that that capability to be to roll that out to different teams without them having to consciously do too much work, right? So, and if they didn't want it, they could simply lock their pipeline, or if they found they had a problem with it, they could lock it. Generally what happens is people lock it temporarily, go and fix the bug in that pipeline, and then unlock, and then go back to the latest version. So that's sort of one. This is, I guess, one of the really nice ways that you can create sort of a catalog of pipelines, and you can break them down even further, right? So you can break them down to actually programmatically go and assemble the different stages, right? So you could say, I want to have a variable number of stages. I don't want to have dev, test, prod. I want a fourth one, or I want another one. And so you can say, you could model your pipeline to be more dynamic or more configurable, right? So you can kind of expose that. But you want to you're better off having different versions of that pipeline, or different variants of that you can choose from. And it means that you're really only specifying the things that are important, right, from a configuration standpoint for that pipeline, right? We're really just specifying, that the name of the thing that we want, the default region that we want it in, and what accounts, and they're the only important things for this particular pipeline, right? So what's my dev account? What's my prod account? What region? What's the project name, right? And that's it. Any questions before I get back to the slides?
Have you considered running? So basically, this is a CI/CD pipeline for deploying serverless database.
Mm-hmm.
Have you also considered moving all the CI part to serverless?
To all what?
CI part.
The CI part.
Tests.
In terms of the running of the tests and things like that,
Yes.
it really comes down to what tests you're running and how you want to run them. So writing tests that execute in Lambda. So we have an example where we kind of did that, where we were running the UI tests in Lambda, right? So running essentially Selenium tests, but wrapping that up in Lambda functions using a headless browser, basically packaged in a Lambda function. And then having basically it, instead of that running inside a container running Selenium, blah blah blah, it was basically just kick off the container running the serverless.
So it's basically Selenium grid implemented as Lambda?
It's not grid. It was more just individual Selenium, like the Selenium tests. It was using the Selenium test driver to basically, and then using Phantom.js underneath as the sort of headless part, all packaged in a Lambda function.
Okay. From my point of view, the biggest difficulty here in running CI is ability to somehow parallelize them between different lambdas. So because lambdas obviously they have restrictions in terms of. Do you have any ideas how to work around these restrictions?
Well, you've got an individual function's concurrency can go, if you get the right limit increase to 10,000 for a single function, right? So an individual function's not necessarily the problem. It's more the communication, and it's more the value in pushing the test part, the test execution. There's definitely some value in pushing the test execution, but not the actual pipeline execution. Because the one thing about Jenkins pipelines, if you're interacting with external resources, they're very lightweight. We don't have to spin up 100 actual EC2 instance slaves, right? We can spin up, a very large number of containers, right, to kind of parallelize job execution, right? So that you can have, a single slave that has an executor queue of like 1,000 executors, and you don't have a problem at that level.
I basically have this use case in mind, Yarn, which runs like thousands of unit tests, and it runs okay on on-demand EC2 instance with multiple cores, like let's say 32 cores. And would it be somehow possible to parallelize this set of Yarn tests using lambdas?
It would be possible. It's just like what the execution would look like. So how you would package that up. Doing it with layer, you could probably package it up as a custom layer. We can probably take it offline, actually.
Sure.
It's a good conversation. Yeah. So let me just quickly go and sort of wrap up. So if you've got any specific questions, come and hassle me. I'll be hanging around afterwards. And I will make sure the slides are up. I'll post a link to the Meetup with a link to the slides so that you can actually see what the slides look like. and I've also taken a screen recording, so hopefully we can mix that into the video. Sort of an obligatory, so as I mentioned earlier, so I'm relatively new to Berlin. I've been here 6 months, and as a company we're growing in this region, and we're actively looking for people that have AWS experience, CI/CD experience, working with development teams, automation, that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in talking, come and see me. And I will also post links to the various GitHub repos as well in the Meetup as well. Thanks.